Hey guys, welcome to my video on how to make Halo 3 on the Master Chief Collection on Steam or computer look tons better than it does. So my biggest problem with Halo 3 is just how drab the game looks. It's not as much that they didn't really remaster the textures of the models, but they could have at least done something about this scene. So the game is very grey, it's very drab, it's very boring, like even this leaf looks sad, which might be considered a bit more of a realistic look, I guess, for the quality of graphics back in the day, but you know, when I play games, I don't necessarily want the game to look super realistic. I want a bit of surrealism to my game. So especially if it's a futuristic game with, you know, advanced space marines. Well, not necessarily space marines, but Spartans. I think space marines are Doom, but in any way. One way you can actually do this is if you have an Nvidia graphics card. I don't actually know if Radeon or AMD graphics cards have a feature for this specifically, and I don't know if Halo has, if there are mods for Halo 3, if it has any mods that do some filters, some recoloring, some color correction, and color adjustments or anything like that, or sharpening. But with Nvidia graphics cards and with GeForce Experience, you have a feature called Game Filter, or Nvidia Game Filter, or GeForce Game Filter, whatever the case may be. And what it allows you to do is basically apply post-processing filters over an already rendered scene. So that allows us to make a game that looks a little bit drab, a little bit boring, make it look quite a lot better. So the filters I use, unfortunately, you won't be actually be able to see the menu as I record because Shadowplay is a little full of nonsense, and for some reason you can't actually see the menu pop up. But if you press Alt F3, that brings up the menu, and it brings it up on the left hand side. It says Game Filter right at the top, so it's probably Nvidia or GeForce Game Filter. And then you have three different style presets and an off button. Right now it is on off, and if I cycle through the styles, nothing happens because I don't have filters applied to them. So you can click on your first style preset, and the filters I actually use for this is firstly brightness and contrast, then the color filter, then details, and then sharpen. Now, I would always start off by just neutralizing everything, putting everything on 0% or neutral, and even then it does make us a little bit of a difference on the scene. But I usually start off with color at first. So you go into the color filter, and my mouse disappeared. Let me alt tab, see if that fixes it. It does. So you go over to your color filter, that's one we're going to start with. And the only thing I adjust in this, you can play around to see with the temperature, especially if you want to make your scene a little bit warmer or a little bit cooler looking. You can play around with the color temperature, but I just have tint color on 0%, tint intensity on 0%, and temperature on 0. And then I lift vibrance, so you can actually lift vibrance to make colors look a lot more vibrant. Now this, with other filters applied on this, is going to look a little bit oversaturated. So I usually just push vibrance to around 32%, just over 30%, or 30 out of 100, and that's it for the color filter. Next, if you go through to your details filter, you're going to have four options or four sliders there. One's called sharpen, the other's clarity, the other HDR toning, and then bloom. Now I do have to mention that this filter is one of the more graphic intensive filters, so any of these filters does have a small impact on graphics performance, but this one specifically, especially since it uses HDR toning, and I don't know exactly what filter it uses for clarity, but these filters do have a little bit more of a performance hit than the others. I don't think brightness and contrast or color filters actually have a performance hit, but sharpening does have a slight one, and like I said, HDR toning does cause a little bit more of a performance hit. But Halo 3 on PC isn't really a demanding game, so if you have even a mid-range graphics card, it shouldn't be an issue. So the first option in this menu is sharpen, which I just leave at 0% because I do use another sharpening filter which has a little bit more features. I will get back to that in a bit. Then you have clarity. Clarity I actually do push to around 70%. This just makes everything less washed up and more clear, obviously, because it is a clarity filter, and it actually gives the scene a lot more depth. So if you look at the far end of the screen, it looks very foggy, it looks very washed out if clarity is dropped, but if clarity is increased, you have a lot more visibility in that area. With HDR toning, this basically just lifts the brightness, and it basically lifts the brightness without affecting the darker areas of the scene as much. And I usually push that to about 60%. If you push it a little bit higher, it does make some scenes, especially in scenes where you have open sky, not like this where it's actually covered by foliage. Where you have an open sky, it's going to be really bright and it's going to be a little bit intrusive. So I just keep it at 60%. That's a really good spot where you have a good amount of brightness coming from your scene without the bright spots on the scene being overbearing. Next, bloom. I do like a little bit of bloom, especially when you have like really bright sunlight areas coming through leaves or coming over a hill or anything like that. So I do lift bloom a little bit, but this game with with phantoms and all that with on their engines or fusion drives or whatever you call them. I apologize for my ignorance in and lack of knowledge of Halo 3 terminology, but they do have quite a bit of a glow to them, so if you push bloom a little bit too high, that gets a little bit distracting, so I would just put bloom at around 6 or 7% just to have a little bit of a glow from sunlight. Next filter you're going to apply is your sharpening filter. Sharpening filter you don't have to do that much with. You just increase the sharpening and then you just adjust the second option, the second slider in the filter, which is ignore film grain, which basically it dulls the graininess made by sharpening the image. So if I sharpen the image all the way, you'll see a lot of the textures get super grainy. What ignore film grain does is it actually takes away the graininess, but you are left with really sharp edges without the textures themselves and the surfaces of themselves being overly grainy. Now, the sharpening filter I raise to about 40%, to between 40 and 50%, and ignore film grain I just leave at around 17. my slider doesn't actually want to go to 17, it jumps between 15 and 20, so I'll probably just leave it at 20% and increase the sharpening filter to 50%. And last, we're going to just do the last little bit of color correction or lighting correction or whatever you want to call it to the scene by going into the brightness and contrast filter. You're going to have 5 sliders here. It's going to be exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, and gamma. Gamma I leave exactly as it is. I actually lift exposure a little bit to 11% apparently, because the slider jumps around a lot. And then I actually lift contrast a little bit as well to around right around 5%. So that gives you a brighter scene, but it still preserves the darker areas of the scene. Next, highlights and shadows. What highlights basically does is it takes the brightest parts of the picture or the brightest parts of the frame and adjusts that. So if you're going to lower highlights, it's going to lower the brighter parts of the scene. If you're going to increase them, it's going to increase the brightness of the brighter parts of the scene. What shadows does is the exact opposite. It adjusts the darker parts of the scene. So if you drop it, the darker parts of the scene actually lighten up, and if you increase it, the darker parts of the scene almost creates like a vignetting effect and just ruins the entire scene. So you just adjust slightly. I have my highlights on right around 5% and my shadows at 5% as well. This just gives a little bit more dynamic to the scene, makes it a little bit more of an experience, but you are going to have to go back into the settings of the filter and adjust it as you play, especially because my settings aren't necessarily perfect for visibility, and it might not be perfect for you because you have a different monitor or your actual Windows color settings are different, or the brightness setting on your monitor itself is different. So to each their own, really, when it comes to adjusting these filters. So you can take my filter settings as a guideline and then just play around with it until you have a natural looking scene, but something a little bit more vibrant, a little bit more colorful, a little bit more detailed and sharp. So to give you guys an idea of the scene, so this exact scene with no filters on, so as the game looks normally, is this. This is how the game normally looks without any filters. Going back into a filter, it makes a huge difference in vibrance and visibility and all of that. And you can take this throughout the entire game, play it a little bit, look into darker corners like that. If it's very dark, you can't really see anything, you might have to decrease your contrast or increase your brightness. So
Bravo team,
you
this
can
is
just play
Johnson.
around
Got him. Fall back to the extraction point.
Get
Over.
a good looking scene, or you can even make your own like creative filter if you really want the game to look that much more different than just a normal vibrant looking scene. You can actually add a creative filter, for example. So you can do letterbox, which gives you a little bit more of a movie vibe, and you can just delete the filters if you don't want them. You can do night mode, which literally just darkens the scene. I don't know what else it does. You can do alt film, which gives you this effect, like a weird paint effect. So there's a lot of things you can play around with. There's black and white filters and all that, but if you just want to increase the vibrance, the sharpness, and the clarity of the game, then the 4 filters you're going to need are brightness and contrast, color, details, and sharpening. So I hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.